5 guest stars walked onto The Muppet Show, and one of them ended up graded like an Olympic gymnast by the show's own resident critics. But no matter what she actually did on stage, she never lost a single point. And that wasn't generosity, it was a running joke with a very specific target. We're going through 5 guest stars who each walked in carrying something real, and by the last one, you'll see exactly why the show's toughest critics ended up as the punchline of their own joke. Every story here is fact-checked against production notes, interviews, and the people who were actually there. Let's start with the guest star who was already working here before anyone knew his name. Chapter 1. Christopher Reeve. Superman once asked this show for permission to be bad at something on purpose, and got it. In 1980, Christopher Reeve walked onto the stage of The Muppet Show as the single most recognizable superhero on the planet and requested something almost nobody in his position would have requested. He wanted to play piano, badly, in front of everyone, and be laughed at for it. His friendship with Henson and Oz didn't start on this set either. It went back to when all 3 of them had worked together on the set of Superman in London, years before this episode ever got made. And Reeve's involvement went further than friendship. Frank Oz personally invited him to help out backstage during that same period, and Reeve actually performed background puppetry himself, taking on one of the Japanese pole vaulters in an earlier episode, long before anyone ever booked him as a guest star. By his own account, stepping out from behind the set to stand in front of it as the build star instead of one of the crew felt strange to him, almost like a promotion he hadn't asked for. So what looks like a one-off guest appearance was actually the payoff of a friendship that had been quietly building from the other side of the puppets. For a man whose entire public identity in 1980 was built around invincibility, flight, and never once looking foolish on camera, this stage may have been one of the only places that year where he was allowed to just be bad at something, in public, on purpose, and have that be the entire point of the scene instead of a mistake to cut around. Chapter 2. Milton Berle. Here's a fact that sounds made up, but genuinely isn't. Some of Milton Berle's most famous heckling was already more than a decade old before it ever set foot on a Muppet stage. Berle came into his episode in 1977 carrying one specific piece of baggage, a routine he had been running since the 1960s where a character named Sidney Spritzer harassed him from a balcony seat across 3 different Berle programs over the years: Texaco Star Theater, the Hollywood Palace, and the Milton Berle Show itself. That bit didn't get reinvented for the Muppets, it got transplanted almost exactly as it existed a decade earlier, straight into Statler and Waldorf's balcony. 2 grumpy old men heckling from above the stage isn't homage, it's the same joke, over a decade later, with felt puppets standing in for the actual comedian Irving Benson. But the heckling isn't really the story here. The real story is backstage, where Fozzie spends the entire episode too afraid to even approach the man he's idolized his whole career, ducking into doorways, rehearsing greetings he never quite finds the nerve to say out loud. That kind of fear is easy to laugh at from a distance, and a lot harder to laugh at once you remember Fozzie's whole character is built on almost being good enough, and never quite believing it. It's only when Berle casually mentions he'd actually like to perform with Fozzie that the whole thing turns around, and they close it out together with a full, top banana duet. Honestly, out of every hero worship storyline this show ever attempted, this is the one that still gets me, because Berle didn't have to say yes to that duet. He chose to in full clown makeup next to a bear made of felt, and for one scene, made Fozzie feel like he belonged there. By now you can probably see the pattern. The Muppet Show's guest bookings were never just decoration, they were strategy, handing a real person with a real career and a real reputation to a room full of writers and seeing how much of their actual life ends up smuggled into the felt. 3 more stories to go, and the next one gets a lot heavier. Hit subscribe now because we're not done. Chapter 3. Brooke Shields. The youngest guest star this show ever booked arrived carrying a legal team's worth of restrictions attached to her contract, and the writers responded to that pressure by building her a nonsense wonderland instead of a headline. In 1979, Brooke Shields was already the most famous teenager on the planet, and her episode landed just as the controversy around her film work, particularly The Blue Lagoon, was becoming a genuine public conversation about how the industry was using her image at that age. Real child labor law didn't just apply to her booking as a formality, it actively shaped how her production days were structured because unlike every adult standing next to her on that stage, there were strict legal limits on how long she was allowed to work, how late she could stay, and how the entire schedule had to bend around her. And what the writers chose to do with that pressure is the part people miss. They didn't build an episode about fame or about being watched or about growing up too fast in public. They built an Alice in Wonderland parody about a kid falling into a nonsense world and simply getting to be a kid in it, chasing rabbits and arguing with playing cards instead of answering questions about her career. In a year when most of the public conversation about her was about everything except her actual childhood, this show quietly handed her one for 40 full minutes. She stayed connected to the Muppets for decades afterward, long after the controversy faded, which tells you the feeling was mutual. Chapter 4. Zero Mostel. Guest star on this show never got to see his own episode air, and the writers had no idea what they were building when they gave him a sketch about vanishing into thin air. Zero Mostel filmed his episode in the middle of 1977, a Broadway and film legend at the very end of a long career, and the writers handed him a solo spotlight called Fears of Zero, built around him listing everything that scared him, alone in a room, while Muppet monsters crawled out of the dark to give each fear a physical shape. Spiders, growing fat, going bald. He counts them off, half comic, half unsettling, holding them at bay just by naming them out loud. Then he reaches the one fear he never quite names, the last one, the one that doesn't get counted away like all the others. And on cue, right there on camera, he vanishes mid-sentence, swallowed by his own poem. 3 months after filming that scene, Zero Mostel died, before the episode had even aired. He remains the only guest star in the show's entire run whose episode was broadcast after his death. Nobody writing that sketch could have known what they were building. It wasn't planned as a tribute. It's just a comedian's poem about vanishing that time happened to make literal, and it's still the single most unsettling few minutes the Muppet Show ever put on air, funny and quietly devastating in the same breath. Chapter 5. Diana Ross. By the season finale, the show's own hecklers had effectively turned into judges, and exactly one performer on that stage was mathematically incapable of losing. That finale aired in 1980, and it starred Diana Ross, the guest star this entire list has been building toward. According to Henson's own team, Ross agreed to the booking because of her daughters, who were genuine fans of the show and had reportedly been asking for months. That's a sweet, low-stakes reason to say yes to a guest spot. What actually aired was anything but low stakes. Statler and Waldorf spent the entire episode scoring every single performer like Olympic judges, holding up numbers after every act, and every Muppet on that stage got hammered with terrible marks, no matter how good the number actually was. Every Muppet except Ross, who received perfect scores over and over, regardless of what she did, even in moments that weren't objectively her strongest. The show built its own audience surrogate characters specifically to be impossible to please, and then had them turn openly hostile toward literally everyone on that stage, except the star herself, the two toughest critics on the show quietly, unintentionally becoming a joke about their own bias. And for her big number, Love Hangover, the workshop built some of the largest puppets ever constructed for the show just to share the stage with her and make the scale match her presence. 5 guest stars, 5 real situations hiding in plain sight behind puppets and stage lights. That's the kind of detail we spend way too long chasing down here at Muppet Culture. So tell us in the comments, which of these 5 surprised you the most? And if 5 wasn't enough, we've got more stories exactly like this one coming in one of our upcoming videos. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The felt is thin, but the meaning is deep. Stay curious.